The Mystery of the 500 Diamonds by Robert Barr. When I say I am called Valmont, the name will convey no impression on the reader, one way or the other. My profession is that of a private detective in London, and my professional name differs from that which I have just given you. But if you ask any policeman in Paris who Valmont was, he will likely be able to tell you, unless he's a recent recruit. If you ask him where Valmont is now, he may not know, yet I have a good deal to do with the Parisian police. For a period of 7 years, I was chief detective to the government of France, and if I am unable to prove myself a great crime hunter, it is because my record of my career is in the secret archives of Paris. I may say at the outset that I have no grievances there, the French government considering itself justified in dismissing me, and it did so. In this action it is quite within its rights, and I should be the last to dispute that right. But on the other hand, I consider myself justified in publishing the following account of what actually occurred, especially as so many false rumors have been put abroad concerning the case. However, as I said at the beginning, I have no grievance, because my worldly affairs are now much more prosperous than they were in Paris, my intimate knowledge of that city and the country of which it is a capital having brought me many cases with which I have dealt more or less successfully since I established myself in London. Without further preliminary, I shall at once plunge into the account of the case which a few years ago riveted the attention of the whole world. The year is 1893, and was a prosperous 12 months for France. The weather was good, the harvest excellent, and the wine of that vintage is celebrated to this day. Everyone was well off and reasonably happy, a marked contrast to the state of things a few years later when dissension rent the country twain. Newspaper readers may remember that in '93 the government of France fell heir to an unexpected treasure which set the whole civilized world agog, especially those inhabitants of it who are inherited in historical relics. This was the finding of the diamond necklace of the Chateau de Chaumont, where it had lain for a century in a rubbish heap in the attic. I believe it has not been questioned that this was a veritable necklace which the court jeweler, Boehmer, hoped to sell to Marie Antoinette, although how it came to be in the Chateau de Chaumont, no one has been able to form even a conjecture. For a century, it was supposed that the necklace had been broken up in London, and its 500 stones, great and small, sold separately. It has always seemed strange to me that the Countess de la Montvials, who was thought to have profited by the sale of these jewels, should not have abandoned France if she possessed money to leave that country, for exposure was inevitable if she had remained. Indeed, this unfortunate woman was branded and imprisoned, and afterwards was dashed to death from the third story of a London house, when, in the dirtiest poverty, she sought escape from the consequences of debt. I am not superstitious in the least, yet this celebrated piece of treasure trove seems actually to have exerted a malign influence over everyone who has had the misfortune to be connected with it. Indeed, in a small way, I who write these words suffered dismal disgrace, though I caught but one glimpse of the dazzling scintillation of jewels. The jeweler who made it met financial ruin. The queen for whom it was constructed was beheaded. The high-born Prince Louis-René Edmond, Cardinal de Réhon, who purchased it, was flung into prison. The unfortunate countess, who said she acted as go-between, clung for 5 awful minutes to a London windowsill before dropping to her death to the flags below. And now, 108 years later, up comes the devil's display of fireworks to the light once again. Juilliard, A working man who found the ancient box seems to have prized it open. Ignorant though as he was, he had probably never seen a diamond in his life before, realized that a fortune was in his grasp. The baleful light from the combination must have sent madness into his brain, working havoc therein as though they were those mysterious rays which scientists have just recently discovered. He might quite easily have walked out of the main gate of the chateau, unsuspected and unquestioned, with the diamonds concealed in his person. But instead of this, he crept from the attic window on the steep roof, slipped to the eaves, dropped, and lay dead with a broken neck, while the necklace, intact, shimmered in the sunlight beside his body. No matter where these jewels had been found, the government had doubtless the first claim upon them, but as the Chateau de Chaumont was a historical monument and the property of France, there could be no question to whom the necklace belonged. The government at once claimed it, and ordered it to be sent with a trustworthy military man to Paris. It was carried safely and delivered promptly to the authorities by a young captain of the artillery, to whom its custody had been entrusted. In spite of its fall from the tower, neither case nor jewels was perceptibly damaged. The lock of the box had apparently been forced by the droille's hatchet, or perhaps by the knife clasp found on his body. On reaching the ground, the lid had flown open, and the necklace was thrown out. I believe there was some discussion in the cabinet regarding the fate of this ill-omened trophy, one section wishing it to be placed in a museum on account of its historical interest, another advocating the breaking up of the necklace and selling it of the diamonds for what they would fetch. But a third party maintained that the method to get the most money into the coffers of the country was to sell the necklace as it stood, for as the world now contained so many rich amateurs who collected undoubted rarities regardless of expense, the historic associations of the jeweled collar would enhance the intrinsic value of the stones, and this view prevailing, it was announced that the necklace would be sold by auction a month later in the rooms of Meyer, Renault and Company, and the Boulevard des Italiens, near the Bank of Credit de Lyonnes. The announcement elicited much comment from the newspapers of all countries, and it seemed that from the financial point of view, at least, the decision of the government had been wise, for it speedily became evident that a notable coterie of wealthy buyers would be congregated in Paris on the 13th, when the sale was to take place. But we of the inner circle were made aware of another result, somewhat more disquieting, which was that the most expert criminals in the world were also gathering like vultures upon the fair city. The honor of France was at stake. Whoever bought the necklace must be assured of a safe conduct out of the country. Whatever happened afterwards, we might view as equanimity. But while he was a resident of France, his life and property must not be engaged. Thus it came about that I was given full authority to ensure neither murder nor theft, nor both combined, should be committed while the purchaser of the necklace remained within our boundaries, and for this purpose the police resources of France were placed unreservedly at my disposal by the government. The broken lock of the jewel case had been very deftly repaired by an expert locksmith, who, in executing his task, was so unfortunate as to scratch a finger on the broken metal, whereupon blood poisoning set in, and although his life was saved, he was dismissed from the hospital with one arm gone. He was usefulness destroyed. When the jeweler Boehmer made a necklace, he asked £160,000 for it, but after years of disappointment, he was content to sell it to Cardinal de Rohan for £64,000, to be liquidated in 3 installments, not one of which was ever paid. This latter amount was probably somewhere near the value of 516 separate stones, one of which was of tremendous size, a very monarch of diamonds, holding its court among 17 brilliants, each as large as a filbert. This iridescent concentration of wealth was in my care, and I had to see that no harm came of the necklace or to the prospective owner until they had safely crossed the boundaries of France. The 4 weeks previous to the 13th proved a busy and anxious time for me. Thousands, most of whom, attenuated by mere curiosity, wished to view the diamonds. They were compelled to discriminate, and sometimes discriminated against the wrong person, which caused unpleasantness. 3 distinct attempts were made to rob the safe, but luckily they were frustrated, and so we came unscathed to the eventful 13th of the month. The sale was to take place at 2 o'clock, and on the morning of that day I took the somewhat tyrannical precaution to have the more dangerous of our known criminals, as many of the foreigners I could trump up charges against, laid by the heels. Yet I knew very well that it was not those rascals I had to fear, but the suave, well-groomed gentlemen, amply supplied with unimpeachable credentials, stopping at our fine hotels and living like princes. Many of these were foreigners against whom we could prove nothing, and whose arrest might land us into temporary international difficulties. Nevertheless, I had each of them shadowed, and on the morning of the 13th, if one of them had even disputed a cab fare, I should have had him in prison half an hour later and taken the consequences. But these gentlemen are very shrewd and do not commit mistakes. I made up a list of all the men in the world who were able or likely to purchase the necklace. Many of them would not be in person in the auction rooms. Their bidding would be done by agents. This simplified matters a great deal, for the agents kept me duly informed of their purposes, and besides an agent who handles treasure every week, is an adept at business, and does not need the protection which must surround an amateur who, in 9 cases out of 10, has but scant an idea of the dangers that threaten him, beyond knowing that if he goes down a dark street in a dangerous quarter, he is likely to be maltreated and robbed. There were no less than 16 clients, all told, who were learned to attend personally on the day of the sale, any one of whom might well make the purchase. The Marquis of Warlingham, the Lord Oxted from England, were well-known jewel fanciers, while at least half a dozen millionaires were expected from the United States, with a smattering from Germany, Austria, and Russia, and 1 each from Italy, Belgium, and Holland. Admission to the auction rooms was allowed by ticket only, to be applied for at least a week in advance, applications to accompanied by satisfactory testimonials. It would possibly have surprised many of the rich men collected there to know that they sat cheek and jowl with some of the most noted thieves of England and America, but I allowed this for 2 reasons. First, I wished to keep those sharper eyes than my own until I knew they had bought the necklace. And secondly, I was desirous that they should not know they were suspected. I had trusty men stationed outside the Boulevard des Italiens, each of which knew by sight the most probable purchasers of the necklace. It was arranged that when the sale was over, I should walk out to the boulevard alongside the man who wins the new owner of the diamonds, and from that moment until he quitted France, my men were not to lose sight of him. If he took personal custody of the stones, instead of doing the sensible thing and proper thing of having them insured and forwarded to his residence by some responsible transit company, or depositing them in the bank. In fact, I took every precaution that occurred to me. All the police in Paris was on the qui vive and felt itself pitted against the scoundrelism of the world. For one reason or another, it was nearly 2:30 before the sale began. There had been considerable delay because of forged tickets, and indeed, each order of admittance was so closely scrutinized that this in itself took a good deal of time more than we had anticipated. Every chair was occupied, and still a number of the visitors had to stand. I stationed myself by the swinging doors at the entrance of the hall, where I could command a view of the entire assemblage. Some of the men were standing with backs against the wall, whilst others were distributed amongst the chairs, all in plain clothes. During the sale, the diamonds themselves were not displayed, but the box containing them rested in the front of the auctioneer, and 3 gentlemen in uniform stood guard on either side. Very quietly, the auctioneer said that there was no need for him to expatiate on the notable character of the treasure he had offered sale, and with his preliminary he requested them to bid. Someone said 20,000 francs, which was received with much laughter. Then the bidding went steadily on until it reached 900,000 francs, which I knew to be less than half the reserve the government had put upon the necklace. The contest advanced more slowly until 1.5 million was touched, and there it hung fire for a time, while the auctioneer remarked that this sum did not equal that which the maker of the necklace had finally been forced to accept for it. After another pause, he said that the reserve was not exceeded, and the necklace would be withdrawn, and probably never again offered for sale. He therefore urged those who were holding back to make their bid. At this, the contest livened until the sum of 2,300,000 francs was been offered, and now I knew the necklace would be sold. Nearing the 3 million mark, the competition thinned down to a few dealers from Hansburg and the Marquis of Warlingham from England, when a voice that had not been heard in the auction room said, in a tone of some impatience, $1 million. There was an instant hush, and then the scribbling of pencils, as each person there reduced the sum to its equivalent in his own currency. Pounds for English, francs for French, marks for the German, and so on. The aggressive tone and the clear-cut fare of the bidder proclaimed him as an American, not less than a financial demonstration he had used. The moment it was realized that his bid was a clear leap more than 2 million francs, and a sigh went up from the audience as if this settled it, and the great sale was done. Nevertheless, the auctioneer's hammer hovered over the lid of his desk, and he looked up and down the long line of faces turned towards him. He seemed reluctant to tap the board, but there was no further price bid against the tremendous sum, and with a sharp click of the mallet fell. "What name?" he asked, bending over towards the customer. "Cash," replied the American. "Here's a check for the amount. I'll take the diamonds with me." "Our request is somewhat unusual," protested the auctioneer mildly. "I know what you mean," interrupted the American. "You think the check may not be cashed. You will notice on it drawn the Credit de l'Anas, which is practically next door. I must have the jewels with me. Send round your messenger to the clerk, and it will take only a few minutes to find out whether or not the money is there to meet it. The necklace is mine, and I must insist on having it." The auctioneer, with some demur, handed the check to the representative of the French government who was present, and this official himself went to the bank. There were some other things to be sold, and the auctioneer endeavored to go through the list, but no one paid the slightest attention to him. Meanwhile, I was studying the comments of the man who had made this astounding bid, and when I should instead have adjusted my preparations to meet the new conditions confronting me. Here was a man about whom we knew nothing whatsoever. I had come to the instant conclusion that he was a prince of criminals, and that some design, not at that moment fathomed me, was afoot to get possession of the jewels. The handing up of the check was clearly a trick of some sort, and I fully expected the official to return and say the draft was good. I determined to prevent the man from getting his case until I knew more of his game. Quietly, I removed from my place near the door to the auctioneer's desk, having 2 objects in view. First, to warn the auctioneer not to part with the treasure too easily, and secondly, to study the suspected man at closer range. Of all evildoers, the American is most to be feared. He uses more ingenuity in planning than his projects, and will take greater risks in carrying them out than any other malefactor on earth. From a news station I saw that he had to deal with. The bidder had a keen, intellectual face and refined, ladylike hands, clean and white, showing they had long been divorced of any manual labor, if indeed they had ever done any useful work. Coolness and imperturbability were his beyond a doubt. The companion who sat at his right was an entirely different stamp. His hands were hairy and suntanned. His face bore the stamp of grim determination and unflinching bravery. I knew that these two types usually hunted in couples, the one to scheme and the other to execute, and they always formed a combination dangerous to encounter and difficult to circumvent. There was a buzz of conversation up and down the hall, and these two men talked together in low tones. I knew now that I was face to face with the most hazardous problem of my life. I whispered to the auctioneer, who bent his head to listen. He knew very well who I was, of course. "You must not give up the necklace," I said. He shrugged his shoulders. "I am under the orders of the officials of the Ministry of the Interior. You must speak to him." "I shall not fail to do so," I replied. "Nevertheless, do not give up the box too readily." "I am helpless," he said with another shrug. "I obey the orders of the government." Seeing it was useless to parley further with the auctioneer, I set my wits to work to meet the new emergency. I felt convinced the check would prove to be genuine, and that the fraud, however it lay, would be disclosed too late to be of service to the authorities. My duty, therefore, was to make sure we had not lost sight neither of the buyer nor of the thing bought. Of course, I could not arrest them for merely on suspicion. Besides, it would make the government the laughingstock of the world if they were to sell a case of jewels and immediately arrest the buyer when they themselves had handed his purchase over to him. And ridicule kills in France. A breath of laughter will blow a government out of existence in Paris much more efficiently than a whiff of cannon smoke. My duty, then, was to give the government full warning and never lose sight of the man until he was clear of France. Then my responsibility was ended. I took aside one of my own men in plain clothes and said to him, "Have you seen the American who has bought the necklace?" "Yes, sir." "Very well. Go outside quietly and station yourself there. He is likely to emerge presently with the casket in his possession. You are not to lose sight of the man or the jewels. I shall follow him and be close behind him as he emerges, so you know you are to shadow us. If he parts with the case, you must be ready to sign from me to follow either the man or the jewels. Do you understand?" "Yes," I answered, and left the room. It is ever the unforeseen that baffles us. It is easy to be wise after the event. I should have sent two men, and I have often thought since how wise in the regulation of the Italian government, which sends out its policemen in pairs. Or I should have given my man power to call for help. But even as it was, he did only half as well as I had the right to expect him to, and the blunder he committed by a moment's dull-witted hesitation. Oh well, there is no use in scolding. After all, the result might have been the same. Just as my man disappeared through the two folding doors, the official from the Ministry of the Interior entered. I intercepted him about halfway between the door and the auctioneer. "Possibly the check appears to be genuine?" I whispered to him. "Certainly," he said pompously. He was a man greatly impressed of his own importance, a kind of character with whom it is always difficult to deal. Afterwards, the government claimed that the official had warned me, and the utterances of an empty-handed ass, dressed in a little brief authority, as the English poet says, were looked upon as the epitome of wisdom. "I urge you strongly not to hand over the necklace as had been requested," I went on. "Why?" he asked. "Because I am convinced the bidder is a criminal." "If you have proof of that, arrest him." "I have no proofs at present moment, but I request you to delay the delivery of the goods." That is absurd, he cried impatiently. The necklace is his, not ours. The money has already been transferred to the account of the government. We cannot retain 5 million francs and refuse to hand over to him what he has bought with him. And so the official left me standing there, nonplussed and anxious. The eyes of everyone in the room had been turned on us during our brief conversation, and now the official proceedingly ostentatiously up the room with a grand air of importance. Then, with a bow and a flourish of the hand, he said dramatically, "The jewels belong to monsieur." The two Americans rose simultaneously, the taller holding out his hand while the auctioneer passed him the case he had apparently paid so highly for. The American nonchalantly opened the box, and for the first time the electric radiance of the jewels burst upon the audience, each member of which caused to crane his neck to behold it. It seemed to me most reckless thing to do, examining the jewels minutely for a few moments, then snapped the lid shut again and calmly put the box in his outside pocket. And I could not help noticing that the light overcoat he wore had pockets made extraordinarily large, as if on purpose for this very case. And now this amazing man walked serenely down the room, past miscreants who would have joyfully cut his throat for even the smallest diamond in that conglomeration. Yet he did not take his trouble to put his hand on the pocket which contained the case, or in any way attempts to protect it. The assemblage seemed stricken dumb at his audacity. His friend followed closely at his heels, and the tall man disappeared through the folding doors. Not so the other, however. He turned quickly and whipped out 2 revolvers out of his pockets, which he presented to the astonished crowd. There had been a movement on the part of everyone in the room, but the sight of these deadly weapons confronting them made everyone shrink into his place. The man with his back to the door spoke his loud and domineering voice, asking the auctioneer to translate what he said into French and German. He spoke in English. "These shinas are valuable. They belong to my friend who has just gone out. Casting no reflections on the generality of the people of this room, there are, nevertheless, 6 crooks among us whom my friend wishes to avoid. Now, no honest man here will object to giving the buyer of that trinket 5 clear minutes in which to get away. It's only the crooks that can kick. I ask these 5 minutes as a favor, but if they are not granted, I am going to take them as a right. Any man who moves will get shot." "I'm an honest man," I cried, "and I object. I'm the chief detective of the government. Stand aside and the police will protect your friend." "Hold on, my son," warned the American, turning one weapon directly upon me, while the other held a sort of roving commission, pointing all over the room. "My friend is from New York, and he distrusts the police as much as he does the grafters. You may be 20 detectives, but if you move before that clock strikes 3, I'll bring you down, and don't you forget it." It is one thing to face death in a fierce struggle, but quite another to advance coldly upon it towards the muzzle of a pistol held so steadily that there could be no chance of escape. The gleam of determination in the man's eyes convinced me he meant what he said. I did not consider them, nor have I considered since, that the next 5 minutes, precious as they were, would be worth paying for with my life. Apparently everyone else was of my opinion, for none moved hand or foot until the clock slowly struck 3. "Thank you, gentlemen," the American said, as he vanished between the spring doors. When I say vanished, I mean the word that's no other, because my men outside saw nothing of this individual then or later. He vanished as if he had never existed, and it was for some hours before we had found out how this was accomplished. I rushed out almost on his heels, as one might say, and hurriedly questioned my waiting men. They'd all seen the tall American come out with the greatest leisure and stroll towards west. As he was not the man any of them were looking for, they paid no further attention to him, as indeed it is custom in the Parisian force. They have eyes for nothing but what they are sent for to look for, and his trait was his drawbacks for the superiors. I ran up the boulevard, my whole thought intent on the diamonds in their bidder, I knew my subordinate in command of the men inside the hall would look after the scoundrel with the pistols. A short distance up, I found the stupid fellow I'd sent out standing in a dazed manner at the corner of the Rue Mediocre, gazing alternately down the Paris de l'Opera and down the short street whose corner he stood. The very fact that he was there was proof that he had failed. "Where's the American?" I cried. "He went down the street, sir." "And why are you standing there like a fool?" "I followed him this far. Then a man came up the Rue Mediocre, and without a word the American handed him the jewel box, turning instantly down the street up where he had come. The other people jumped into a cab and drove towards the Place de l'Opera." "And what did you do? Stood there like a post, I imagine?" "I didn't know what to do, sir. It all happened in a moment." "Why didn't you follow the cab?" "I didn't know which to follow, sir, and the cab was gone instantly when I watched the American." "What was its number?" "I don't know, sir." "You clod, why didn't you call one of our men, whoever was nearest, and leave him to follow the American while you followed the cab?" "I did shout to the nearest man, sir, but you said you told him to stay there and watch the English lord. And even before he had said that, both American and cabman had disappeared." "Was the man to whom he gave the box an American also?" "No, sir. He was French." "How do you know?" "By his appearance and the words he spoke." "I thought you said he didn't speak." "He did not speak to the American, sir, but he said to the cabman, 'Drive to the Madeleine as quickly as you can.'" "Describe the man." "He was a head shorter than the American, wore a black beard and mustache rather neatly trimmed, and seemed to be a superior sort of artisan." "Did you not take the number of the cab? Should you know the cabman if you saw him again?" "Yes, sir, I could." Taking this fellow with me, I returned to the now empty auction room, and there gathered all my men to me. Each in his own notebook took down descriptions of the cabman and his passenger from the lips of my incompetent spy. Then I dictated a full description of the two Americans and scattered my men to the various railway stations of the lines leading out of Paris, with orders to make inquiries at the police on duty there, and to arrest one or more of the four persons described, should they be so fortunate as to find any of them, which I much doubted. I learned now that the man with the pistol was vanished so completely as he did. My subordinate in the auction room had speedily solved the mystery. To the left of the main entrance of the auction room was a door that gave access to the premises in the rear. As the attendant in charge confessed when questioned, he had been bribed by the American earlier that day to leave the side door open to allow the man to escape with the goods entrance. Thus the ruffian had not appeared on the boulevard at all, and had not been so observed by any of my men. Taking my spy with me, I returned to my own office and sent the order throughout the city that every cabman who had been on the Boulevard des Italiens between 2:30 and 3:30 that afternoon was to report to me. The examination of these men proved very tedious business indeed, but whatever other countries may say of us, we French are patient. And if the haystack was searched long enough, the needle will be found. I did not discover the needle I was looking for, but I came upon one quite as important, if not more so. It was nearly 10 o'clock at night when a cabman answered my oft-repeated question in the affirmative. "Did you take up a passenger a few minutes past 3 o'clock on the Boulevard des Italiens, near the Crédit Lyonnais? He had a short black beard. Did he carry a small box in his hand and order you to drive to Madeleine?" The cabman seemed puzzled. "He had a short black beard when he got out of the cab," he replied. "What do you mean by that?" "I drive a closed cab, sir. When he got in, he was the smooth-faced gentleman. When he got out, he wore a short black beard. Was he a Frenchman? No, sir. He was a foreigner, either English or American. Did he carry a box? No, sir. He had a small handbag. Where did he tell you to drive? He told me to follow the cab in front, which had just driven off very rapidly towards Medellin. In fact, I heard the man such as you describe order the other cabman to drive to Medellin. I had come up to the curb of this man held up his hand for a cab, but the open cab cut in just ahead of me. Just then my passenger stepped out and said in French, but with a foreign accent, "Follow that cab wherever it goes." I turned with some indignation to my spy. "You told me," I said, "that the American had gone down a side street, yet he evidently met a second man, obtained from him the handbag, and turned back, and got into a cab close behind you." "Well, sir," said the man, "I could not look in two directions at the same time. The American certainly went down the side street, but of course I watched the cab which contained the jewels." "And you saw nothing of the closed cab right at your elbow?" "Boulevard was full of cabs, sir, and the pavement crowded with passers-by, as it always is at this hour of the day, and I only have 2 eyes in my head." "I'm glad to know you had that many, for I was beginning to think you were blind." Although I said this, I knew in my heart it was useless to console the poor wretch, for the fault was entirely my own in not sending 2 men, and in failing to guess the possibility of the jewels and their owner being separated. Besides, here was a clue to my hand at last, and no time must be lost in following it up. So I continued my interrogation of the cabman. Thank you for the hydrate. The other cab was an open vehicle, you say? "Well, yes, sir." "You succeeded in following it?" "Oh, yes, sir. At the Madeleine, the man in the front redirected the coachman, who turned to the left and drove to the Place de Caulaincourt, then up the Champs-Élysées to the Arch, and so down the Avenue de la Grande Armée, and the Avenue de Neuilly, where it came to a standstill. My fare got out, as I saw he had a short black beard, which he had evidently put on inside the cab. He gave me a 10-franc piece, which was very satisfactory." "And the fare you were following, what did he do?" "He got out, paid the cabman, and went down to the bank by the river, and on board a steam launch that seemed to be waiting for him." "Did you look behind or appear to know that he was being followed?" "No, sir." "And your fare?" "He ran after the first man also aboard the steam launch, which instantly started down the river." "And that is when you last saw them?" "Oh, yes, sir." "And what time did you reach the Pont de Neuilly?" "I do not know, sir. I had to drive rather fast, but the distance is 7 or 8 kilometers." "So you could do it under an hour?" Certainly under an hour." "You must have reached there about 4 o'clock." "It is very likely, sir." The plan of the tall American was now perfectly clear to me, and it comprised nothing that was contrary to the law. He had evidently placed his luggage on board the steam launch in the morning. The handbag contained various materials which would enable him to disguise himself. This bag he had probably left in some shop town of the side street, or else someone was waiting with it for him. Giving of the treasure to another man was not so risky as it had first appeared, because he instantly followed that man. It was probably his confidential servant. Despite the windings of the river, there was ample time to launch and reach the Havre before the American steamer sailed away on Saturday morning. I surmised it was his intention to come along with the steamer before he left her berth in the Havre harbor, and thus transfer himself and his belongings unperceived by anyone to the watch on the land side of the liner. All this, of course, was perfectly justifiable and was, in truth, a well-laid scheme for escaping observation. His only danger was being tracked was when he got into the cab. Once away from the neighborhood of the Boulevard des Italiens, he was reasonably sure to evade pursuit, and the 5 minutes which his friend with the pistols had given him would just about give him the time he needed to get as far as the Place Marsan. And after that evening everything was easy. Yet, if it had not been for this 5 minutes secured by coercion, I should not have had the slightest excuse for arresting him. But he was accessory after the fact, and that piece of illegality. In fact, it was absolutely certain that he had been an accessory before the act, and guilty of conspiracy with a man who had presented firearms to the auctioneer's audience, and who had interfered with an officer in the discharge of his duty by threatening me and my men. So I was now legally in the right of arresting every person on board that steam launch. With a map of the river before me, I proceeded to make some calculations. It was now nearly 10 o'clock at night. The launch had had 6 hours to go at its utmost speed. It was doubtful if a small vessel could make 10 miles an hour, even with the current in its favor, which is rather sluggish because of the locks and the level country. 60 miles would place her beyond Melun, which is 58 miles from the Port Royal, and of course the lesser distance from the Ponte de Neuilly. But the navigation of the river is difficult at all times, and almost impossible after dark. There were chances of the boat running aground, and then there was the inevitable delay at the locks. So I estimated that the launch could not have reached Melun, which was less than 25 miles from Paris by rail. Looking up at the timetable, I saw there were still 2 trains in Milan, and the next at 10:25, which reached Milan at 11:40. I had time to reach St. Lazarus Station, and there to do some telegraphing before the train left. With 3 of my assistants, I got into the cab and drove to the station, sending one of my men to hold the train while I went to the telegraph office, cleared the wires, and then to the communication to the lockmaster of Milan. He replied that no steam launch had passed down since an hour before sunset. Then I instructed him to allow the yachts to enter the lock, close the upper gate, and let half the water out, and hold the vessel there until I came. I also ordered the local Milan police to send enough men to the lock to enforce his command. Lastly, I sent messages along the river asking the police to report to me on the train the passage of the steam launch. The 10:25 is a slow train, stopping at every station. However, every drawback has its compensations, and these stoppages enabled me to receive and to send telegraphic messages. I was quite well aware that I might be on a fool's errand in going to Milan. The yacht might turn before it had steamed a mile and come back to Paris. There had been no time to learn whether this were or so or not. If I was to catch the 10:25, also it might have landed its passengers anywhere along the river. I might say at once that neither of these 2 things happened, and my calculations as to her movements were accurate to the letter. But a trap most carefully set may be prematurely sprung in inadvertence, or often more by overzeal by some stupid ass who fails to understand his instructions, or oversteps them as if they are misunderstood. I received the most annoying telegram from Devnil, a lock about 13 miles above that in Merlin. The local policeman, arriving at the dock, looked around for the yacht had just cleared. The fool shouted to the captain to return, threatening with him the fines and penalties of the law if he refused. The captain did refuse and ran on full speed ahead and disappeared into the darkness. Though this well-meant blunder of an understrapper who's on board the launch had received warning that they were on the track. I telegraphed to the lockkeeper at Dunwall to allow no craft to pass towards Paris until further orders. We had the launch trapped in a 13-mile stretch of water, but the night was pitch dark and the passengers might be landed on either bank, with all France before them. It was midnight when I reached the lock at Milan, and as I expected, nothing had been seen or heard of the launch. It gave me some satisfaction to telegraph to that dunderhead in Dunwall to walk away from the riverbank to Milan and report if he learned about the launch's whereabouts. We took up our quarters in the lockkeeper's house and waited. There was little sense in sending men to scour the country at this time of night, for the pursued were on the alert and were not likely to allow themselves to be caught if they did go ashore. On the other hand, there was every chance that the captain would refuse to let them land, because he knew that his vessel was in a trap from which he could not escape. And although the demand of the policeman at Dunwall was quite unauthorized, nevertheless the captain must be well aware of his danger in refusing to obey that command. Even if he got away for the moment, he must know that arrest was certain and that his punishment would be most severe. His only plea could be that he had not heard or understood the order of return, but this plea would be invalidated if he aided the escape of two men who, he must know now, were wanted by the police. I was, therefore, very confident that if the men demanded to be set ashore, the captain would refuse when he had had time to think about his own danger. My estimate proved accurate, for towards 1 o'clock the lockkeeper came in and said the green and red lights of an approaching craft were visible, and as he spoke the yacht whistled for the opening of the lock. I stood by the lockkeeper while he opened the gate. My men and the local police were concealed on each side of the lock. The launch came slowly in, and as soon as it had come in, I asked the captain to step ashore, which he did. "I wish to have a word with you," I said. "Follow me." I took him to the lockkeeper's house and closed the door. "Where are you going?" "To Havre." "Where did you come from?" "Paris." "From what quay?" "From the Pont de Neuilly." "When did you leave there?" "At 5 minutes to 4 o'clock this afternoon." "Were you engaged to make this voyage?" "An American. I do not know his name." "He paid you well, I assume?" "He paid me what I asked." "Have you received the money?" "Yes, sir." "I may inform you, Captain, that I am a chief detective of the French government, and that all the police in France at this moment are under my control. I ask you, therefore, to be careful of your answers. You were ordered by a policeman at Dunwall to return. Why did you not do so?" "The lockkeeper ordered me to return, but he has no right to order me. I went on." "You know very well it was a policeman who ordered you, and you ignored a command. Again, I ask you why you did so." "I did not know it was a police." Sorry. "I thought you would say that. You know very well, but you were paid to take risk, and it is likely to cost you dear. You had 2 passengers aboard." "Yes, sir." "Did you put them ashore between here and Dunwall?" "No, sir, but one of them went overboard, and we couldn't find him again." "Which one?" "The short man." "Then the American is still aboard?" "What American, sir?" "Captain, you must not trifle with me. The man who engaged you is still aboard." "Oh, no, sir. He was never been aboard." "Do you mean to tell me that the second man who came at your launch at Pont de Neuilly is not the American who engaged you?" "Oh, no. The American was a smooth-faced man. This man has a black beard." "Yes, a false beard." I did not know that, sir. I understood from the American that I was to take but one passenger. One came aboard with a small box in his hand, and the other with a small bag. Each claimed to be the passenger in question. I did not know what to do, so I left both of them on board. Then the tall man with the beard is still with you? Yes, sir. Well, Captain, is there anything else you have to tell me? I think you will find it better in the end to make a clean breast of it. The captain hesitated, turning his cap about in his hands for a few moments, and said, I'm not sure that the first passenger went overboard on his own accord. When the police hailed us at Deneuve. Ah, you knew it was the police then. I was afraid after I left it might have been. You see, when the bargain was made with me, the American said that if I reached Havre at a certain time, 1,000 francs extra would be paid to me, so I was anxious to get along as quickly as I could. I told him it was dangerous to navigate the Seine at night, but he paid me well for attempting it. After the policeman called me at the Duval, the man with the small box became very much excited and asked me to put him ashore, which I refused to do. The tall man appeared to be watching him, never letting him get far away. When I heard the splash in the water, I ran aft and saw the tall man putting the box, which the other man held, into his handbag, although I said nothing of it to him. We cruised back and forward on the spot where the other man had gone overboard, but saw nothing more of him. Then I came to Milan, intending to give information about what I had seen. That is all I know on the matter, sir. Was the man who had the jewels a Frenchman? What jewels? The man with the small box. Oh, yes, sir, he was French. You hinted that the foreigner threw him overboard. What grounds have you for such belief if you did not see the struggle? The night is very dark, sir, and I did not see what happened. I was at the wheel in the forward part of the launch with my back turned to these two. I heard a scream, then a splash. If the man had jumped overboard, as the other said, he would have not screamed. Besides, as I told you, when I ran aft, I saw the foreigner put the little box in his handbag, which he shut up quickly, as if he did not wish me to notice. Very good, Captain. If you told the truth, it will go easier on you in the investigation that is to follow. I now turned the captain over to one of my men and ordered the foreigner with his bag and bogus black whiskers. Before questioning him, I ordered him to open the bag, which he did with evident reluctance. It was filled with false whiskers, false mustaches, and various bottles, but on top of them all lay the jewel case. I raised the lid and displayed the accursed necklace. I looked up at the man, who stood there calmly enough, saying nothing in spite of the overwhelming evidence against him. Will you oblige me by removing the fake whiskers? He did so at once, throwing them into the open bag. I knew the moment I saw him that he was not the American, and thus my theory had broken down, in one very important part at least. Informing him who I was, and cautioning him to speak the truth, I asked him how he came into the possession of Am I under arrest? Certainly, I replied. Of what am I accused? You're accused in the first place of having in your possession property which does not belong to you. I plead guilty of that. What is the second place? In the second place, you may find yourself accused of murder. I am innocent of the second charge. The man jumped overboard. If that was true, why did he jump as he went over? Because, too late to recover his balance, I seized the box and held it. He was in rightful possession of the box. The owner gave it to him. I admit that. I saw the owner give it to him. Then why should he jump overboard? I do not know. He seemed to become panic-stricken when the police at the last lock ordered us to return. He implored the captain to put him to shore, and from that moment I kept watch on him keenly, expecting that if we drew near the land he would attempt to escape, and the captain had refused to beach the launch. I remained quiet for about half an hour, seated on the camp chair by the rail, with his eyes turned towards the shore, trying, as I imagined, to penetrate the darkness and estimate the distance. Then suddenly he sprang up and made his dash. I was prepared and instantly caught the box in his hand. He gave a half-turn, trying either to save himself or to retain the box. Then with a scream he went down shoulders first into the water. It all happened within a second after he leapt from his chair. You admit yourself, then, indiscreetly responsible for his drowning at least. I see no reason to suppose that the man was drowned. If able to swim, he could easily have reached the river bank. I'm unable to swim. If unable to swim, why should he attempt it encumbered by the box? You believe he escaped, then? I think so. It will be lucky for you should that at least be the case. Certainly. How did you come to be on the yacht at all? I shall give you a full account of the affairs, concealing nothing. I am a private detective with an office in London. I was made certain that some attempt would be made by probably the most expert criminals at large to rob the possessor of this necklace. I came over to Paris, anticipating trouble, determining to keep an eye upon the jewel case, if this was proved possible. If the jewels were stolen, the crime was bound to be one of the most celebrated in legal annals. I was present during the sale and saw the buyer of this necklace. I followed the official who went to the bank, and thus learned that the money behind the check. Then I stopped outside and waited for the buyer to appear. He had the case in his hand. In his pocket, you mean? He had it in his hand when I saw him. Then the man who afterwards jumped overboard approached him, took the case without a word, held up his hand for a cab, and when an open vehicle approached the curb, he stepped in saying, "The Madeleine." I hailed the closest cab, instructed the cabman to follow, disguising myself with whiskers as near as those of the man in front of me, and I had my collection. Why did you do that? As a detective, I should know why I did it. I wished as nearly as possible to resemble the man in front, so that if necessary arose, I could pretend that I was the person commissioned to carry the jewel case. As a matter of fact, the crisis arose when we came to the end of the cab journey. The captain did not know which of us was the true passenger, and so he let us both on board the launch. And now I have told you my whole story. An extremely improbable one, sir. Even by your own account, you had no right to interfere with this business at all. I quite agree with you there, he replied with great nonchalance, taking a card from his pocketbook and handed it to me. That is my London address. You may make inquiries, and you will find I am exactly what I represent myself to be. The first train for Paris left Milan at 11 minutes past 4 in the morning. It was now 2:15. I left the captain, crew, and launch in charge of 2 of my men, and orders to proceed to Paris as soon as it was daylight. I, supported by the 3rd man, waited at the station with our English prisoner, and reached Paris at 5:30 in the morning. The English prisoner, though severely interrogated by the judge, stood by his story. Inquiry by the police in London proved that he was who he said he was. His case, however, began to look very serious when the 2 of the men from the launch asserted that they had seen him push the Frenchman overboard, and their statement could not be shaken. All our energies were bent to the next 2 weeks in trying to find something of the identity of the missing man, or to any trace of the 2 Americans. If the tall American were alive, it seemed incredible that he should not have made application of missing property. All attempts to trace him by means of Crédits Lyonnais proved futile. We made inquiries about every missing man in Paris, but also with little result. The case had excited much attention throughout the world, and doubtless was published in the full of the American papers. The Englishman had been in custody 3 weeks when the chief of police of Paris received the following letter. Dear Sir, on my arrival in New York by the English steamer Lusitania, I was much amused to read in the papers the accounts of the exploits of the detectives, French and English. I am sorry that only one of them seems to be in prison. I think his French confrere ought to be there also. I regret exceedingly, however, that there is a rumor of death by drowning of my friend Eugene Dabos of 375 Rue Archouf, Rouen. If this is indeed the case, he has met his death through the blunders of the police. Nevertheless, I wish to communicate with his family at the address I have given, and assure them that I will make arrangements for their future support. I may say that I am a manufacturer of imitation diamonds, and through extensive advertising, have accumulated a fortune of many millions. I was in Europe when I found the necklace was found, and had in my possession over 1,000 imitation diamonds of my own manufacture. It occurred to me that there was the opportunity of the most magnificent advertisement in the world. I saw a necklace, retrieved its measurements, and also obtained photographs of it taken by the French government. Then I set my expert friend, Eugene Dubois, at work, and he made an imitation necklace so closely resembling the original that you apparently did not know it is the unreal you have in your possession. I was not nearly so much afraid of the villainy of the crooks as to the blundering of the police, who would have protected me with brass band vehemence, and I could not elude them. I knew that the detectives would overlook the obvious, but would at once follow a clue if I provided one for them. Consequently, I laid my plans just as you have discovered, and got Eugene Dubois up in the Rouen to carry the case. I have gave him down to Havre, and had another box prepared in brown paper with the address of New York written upon them. The moment I emerged from the auction house, while my friend the cowboy was holding up the audience, I turned my face to the door and took out the genuine diamonds from the case and slipped into the box I had prepared for mailing, and to the genuine case I put the bogus diamonds. After handing the box to Dubois, I returned down the side street and then to another name I do not know, and there in a shop, with sealing wax and string, did up my package for posting, labeled the package as books, went to the nearest post office, paid letter postage, and handed it over unregistered as if it were no particular value. After I went to my rooms in the Grand Hotel, where I had been staying under my own name for more than a month, next morning I took the train to London, and the day after sailed from Liverpool to Lucania. I arrived at the Gascogne, which sailed from Havre on Saturday, met my box at the customs house, paid duty, and now repossessed in my safe. I intend to construct an imitation necklace, which will be like the genuine one, that nobody can tell the two apart. I shall then come to Europe and exhibit the pair, for publication, and truth of the matter will give me the greatest advertisement that ever was. Yours truly, John P. Hazard. I had once communicated with Rowan and found Eugene Dubois was right. The first words were, "I swear I did not steal the jewels." He had to swim ashore, tramped to Rowan, and kept quite quiet in great fear of what would happen. It took Mr. Hazard longer to make his imitation necklace than he supposed, and several years later he took passage to the two necklaces on the ill-fated steamer Bergen, and now rests beside them at the bottom of the Atlantic. As the English poet says, full many a gem of purest ray serene, the dark, unfathomed caves of ocean bare.